Okay. P is in parlay.
No, C. C as in Charlie. C as in cat. C as in California.
Okay. Okay. C, like C is in coconut.
2.
Yes, right.
3.
Okay.
Now, number 8.
4.
Now, after the C, it should be number 8. After that, it should be number 8.
6.
Okay. The letter C
7.
and then letter 8.
Yes. And then B as in Bravo.
9. 10.
And then number 7.
2.
What is this for
3.
again?
This is the refund ID number, okay?
Okay.
15.
C, 8.
What did you... Yes,
A,
yes, yes. And then number 4.
number 4.
And then number 8.
Okay.
And then D as in dog.
Uh-huh.
And then number 8 once again. And then 0, 0,
Yep.
9.
0, 0.
Okay? Now read me out very slowly.
Okay. It's C is in Coca-Cola.
1.
B is in
Yes,
2.
baby.
3.
yes,
Sorry, C is in baby bottle. 8.
4.
B is in baby bottle.
yes,
5.
Yes.
009.
6.
yes.
7.
Is that it?
Have you done typing in?
8.
Writing it? Have you done writing it down?
Yeah.
9.
Now I want you to write down the cancellation ID number, okay?
Okay.
1.
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
it's
2.
number 8, number 8, number 8.
Oh, hey, can you hold on 1 second?
3.
I got to, I told
4.
I was supposed to get something.
That's 30.
I'm trying to snore recipe.
Okay. All right.
I got to get something out of my refrigerator. Like,
All right.
it's really small. Is it normal?
No problem. It will be normal. It will be normal after some time, okay?
It's because I can't see anything. It's so small because my eyesight's so bad.
No problem.
This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, though, we're going to take a look at the other end of the spectrum with a look at the worst rares ever printed. Since you typically only get a single rare in a booster pack, you're usually hoping to get a powerful or at least useful card. However, a card's rarity doesn't always mean that the card is good, and that's certainly what you're going to see in this list. In fact, this is one of the worst ones I've ever done. It's so bad that Wood Elemental didn't even make it because it actually kind of does something, unlike the other cards on this list. While opening a lower rarity bad card in a booster pack is frustrating, getting one that takes up your rare slot is even worse. To be eligible for this list, the card had to be rare in its original printing. This list won't have mythic rares, as I've already done a worse list for those. You should check that list out, though, if you're in the mood for even more terrible cards. While the cards that appear on this list and the order in which they appear is left up to my opinion, there are some important things that have to be true about a card for it to show up on this list. First, it has to be bad in each of Magic's 3 main play modes. That is 40-card limited, 60-card constructed,
42.
and 99-card commander. Additionally, the card has to have always been bad. In other words, for a card to truly be considered one of the worst ever, it has to be bad everywhere and throughout all of that card's history. Alright, let's get started with my picks for the 10 worst rares in Magic. At number 10, I've got Common Cause. This rare enchantment costs 2 generic and a white, and all non-artifact creatures get +2/+2 as long as they share a color. Of all the cards on this list, this is really the only one where you read the text box and you might think it's actually good, but once that sentence really sinks in, you realize how bad it is. The big problem here is that the design is entirely symmetrical. In other words, your opponent's creatures also have to be the same color, or this doesn't do anything. That's something you have virtually no control over. You have to count on you and your opponent both playing monocolored decks of the same color for this to offer its bonus consistently, and even when it does, that means your opponent's creatures are getting that bonus too, and that's basically just a wash. So this card really doesn't do anything. At number 9, I've got Acidic Dagger. You might be thinking that this card has a black set symbol, so it isn't rare, but this card's from 1996's Mirage, and color-coded set symbols didn't make their debut until 1998, so trust me, it might not look rare, but it is. That's true for some other cards on this list, too. This rare artifact costs 4 mana, and you can pay 4 and tap it to make it so that whenever target creature deals combat damage to a non-wall creature, you destroy that non-wall creature. If we stop there, this would definitely be a bad and very clunky card, but it would actually have some real upside. However, the rest of the card's text box makes it much worse, because you can only activate the ability before blockers get declared, and if the creature you target leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice Acidic Dagger too. In other words, your opponent knows exactly what creature you use the ability on, and they have the ability to easily 2-for-1 you if they can deal with your creature, and the meager upside definitely isn't worth that miserable downside. At number 8, it's Assembly Hall. This rare artifact costs 5 generic mana, and you can pay 4 and tap it, and reveal a creature card from your hand to search your library for a copy of that card and put it into your hand. In other words, before Assembly Hall actually does something, you first have to invest 9 mana. And the payoff? Highly conditional card draw. If you don't have a creature card in your hand that has the right name, this ability doesn't do anything. Obviously, this card is at a natural disadvantage in a singleton format like Commander, but it's terrible everywhere else too. You just can't spend this much mana on drawing a card, and this doesn't even always do that. At number 7, I've got the Lace Cycle. They all cost a single mana of a single color, and they're all instants that can make a spell or permanent become that color. Yeah, that kind of effect is very rarely actually going to do anything. Sure, if you get some protection or other color hate stuff going, it can be kind of funny. However, that means you're playing a bunch of cards in your deck that only do their color hate effect in situations where you get your laces, in which case your deck is terrible. And I don't think using up a card to change the color of a spell or permanent is going to be worth it even in a world where you do have a deck filled with silly color hate effects. Still, as bad as they are, the fact that they are at least really easy to cast keeps them from showing up higher on the list. At number 6, it's Hint of Insanity. For 2 generic and a black, this rare sorcery reveals your opponent's hand, and then they discard all non-land cards with the same name as another card in their hand. In other words, this is the world's most conditional discard effect, which means that much of the time you're going to pay 3 mana for the privilege of discarding Hint of Insanity, which definitely isn't what you want to be doing. Like Assembly Hall, Hint of Insanity is at a serious disadvantage in Commander, but it was never played in 60-card formats either. While the effect will actually do something more frequently in those sorts of formats, it still whiffs more often than it doesn't. So if you're playing this card, I think you've got a lot more than just a Hint of Insanity. At number 5, it's Parallax Inhibitor. This rare artifact costs 2 mana, and you can pay 1 generic and sacrifice it to put a fade counter on each permanent with fading you control. Fading is a masks block mechanic. Cards with it enter the battlefield with some number of fading counters, then you remove one of them at the beginning of your upkeep. When you can't remove a counter, that permanent gets sacrificed. So the idea behind the inhibitor is it gives your fading permanents one more turn. There are only 20 cards with fading, but many of them have actually left their mark on the game. So much so that I've actually done a top 10 on them. But guess what? Even decks that featured multiple cards with fading didn't run the inhibitor. That goes to show you just how bad this card was. People were playing cards with fading, but no one was actually playing this. It was just way too inefficient, and getting that extra turn out of a card really wasn't worth it. This is also a pretty good lesson about parasitic design. A parasitic design refers to something that only interacts with some very specific things from a single set or block, but is useless in Magic more broadly. They could have designed the inhibitor in such a way that it actually did something with any counters. Obviously, Proliferate didn't exist at the time, but they still could have allowed this to add a counter to all of your permanents with counters instead, at which point it would be a card that actually matters. Instead, it interacts with a single, little-used mechanic and doesn't do a good job of it either. At number 4, I've got Malignant Growth. For For 3 generic, a green, and a blue, it's an enchantment that gets a growth counter every upkeep. Then, at the beginning of each opponent's draw step, that player draws an additional card for each growth counter on Malignant Growth. Then Malignant Growth deals damage to the player equal to the number of cards they drew this way. In other words, this draws your opponent a bunch of extra cards, and it doesn't punish them nearly enough for that downside to be worth it. And, for good measure, it also has cumulative upkeep 1, which means you have to pay an ever-increasing amount of mana each upkeep to just keep it in play. This does mean you can get rid of this whenever you want, and you're probably going to want to the first turn you can, but that still means you paid 5 mana and a card for no effect at all, and you never want to do that. This actively hurts you more than the other cards on this list do, but it doesn't quite make it to the top of the list for me, because at least Malignant Growth is a little fun for political purposes in Commander. The other cards on this list can't even really be described as fun in any situation. At number 3, it's Razor Pendulum. This 4-mana artifact checks a player's life total at the beginning of that player's instep, and if they have 5 or less life, it does 2 damage to that player. In other words, Razor Pendulum does absolutely nothing for most of the game, and even once it starts doing something, the best it can do is put your opponent on a 3-turn clock. And of course, it's also symmetrical, so if you end up behind in the race, you can end up suffering from your own pendulum. You might be thinking that this could be a finisher for aggro or burn decks or something, but it isn't like those decks are hurting for more flexible and efficient ways to do direct damage to the opponent, so 4 mana is way too much to pay for a card that is insanely situational, and basically a blank card for the majority of most games. At number 2, I've got Psychic Transfer. For 4 generic and a blue, this lets you exchange life totals with your opponent. This sort of effect is already incredibly situational and very rarely worth doing, but this has one really important requirement, or it can't do anything. The difference between your life total and your opponent's has to be 5 or less. The best this is ever going to do is make your opponent lose 5 while you gain 5. Now, if it was always capable of doing that, we'd be talking about a perfectly solid card, but it can't.
24.
If you're playing Psychic Transfer, it's simply going to be a blank or insignificant card about 99% of the time,
25.
and obviously, that means you should never play it. And at number 1, I have North
26.
Star. This rare artifact costs 4 generic mana, and you can pay 4 and tap it. Then, for 1 spell that turn, you can spend mana as though it were mana of any type to pay that spell's mana cost. So, we're talking about investing 8 mana before this does anything, and then the thing it does is laughably useless. Basically, it's the world's most expensive way to filter mana. You just don't tend to run cards that you would have a hard time casting in the first place, and North Star definitely isn't an incentive to try and do that, since it effectively adds attacks of 4 mana anytime you want to use the ability, and that really defeats the purpose of fixing your mana in the first place. So, those are my picks for the 10 worst rares in the history of Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you're trying to prove me wrong, check...
In July of 2012, theatregoers excitedly waited for the opening show of Batman: The Dark Knight Rises, and adults and children alike were dressed head to toe in cosplay. Nothing seemed amiss as the movie began, but only 20 minutes into their adventure, chaos erupted when one of those viewers arrived, armed to the teeth with firearms and ammunition, and tragically, he would show no mercy to his audience.
28.
The results were catastrophic, killing dozens and injuring dozens more. But
29.
who was their killer? What was his motive? And how did his terrible history lead him down this path? It is great to see young folks, and you probably know where you are by now. My name is Adrian, and you've stepped into the happy house of crime. And I will tell you the story before I serve you coffee. Just a reminder that in light of terrible tragedies like this one, this video serves as a documentary to better understand how such events occur, and not to glorify the deplorable actions of the killer. And by the way, I post up to 4 times a week here, 2 long-form videos and 2 shorts. So if you like dark and fascinating stories, please consider subscribing. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat, and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of James Holmes. Although our case today doesn't occur in San Diego, James's story begins here. And so, on that note, welcome to America's finest city, folks. That's a nickname, by the way, not my opinion. As many of you know, San Diego is a vibrant coastal city located in the southern part of California. Known for its mild climate, beautiful beaches, and cultural diversity, San Diego is a popular tourist destination and a very desirable place to live. The city is home to several notable attractions, including Balboa Park, which houses museums, gardens, and the world-renowned San Diego Zoo. The historic Gaslamp Quarter offers a lively downtown experience with a mix of restaurants, shops, and entertainment venues. San Diego is also a central hub for the US Navy, hosting a significant naval presence here. With a strong emphasis on outdoor activities, a thriving craft beer scene, and a laid-back Southern California atmosphere, it is no surprise that San Diego attracts people worldwide for both leisure and business. Moving into the focal person in our case today, James was lucky enough to be welcomed into a prosperous family here in San Diego. Born on December the 13th, 1987, his parents were professionals in the academic and medical industries. His childhood was very comfortable, to say the least, and he enjoyed a middle to upper class lifestyle in one of America's most beautiful cities. His father, Robert, was the academic. A mathematician and a scientist at heart, he was renowned for his repertoire of high-level degrees. With education from various prestigious universities such as Stanford, UCLA, and UC Berkeley, Robert was an intellectual through and through, and was something he hoped to pass down to his son. As for his mother, Arlene was a medical practitioner. She took pride in her occupation as a registered nurse, and, just like her husband, was known to be quick-thinking, methodical, and thorough in her work. Due to his parents' success, James lived in a comfortable home in the Oak Hills community of Monterey. Now, this is a lovely part of California, and is very close to the ocean. And so, as a child, James was very lucky to be living here. And on top of that, he was known to be remarkably bright and had many friends at school. Interested in anything involving technology, James formed a close group of friends in early elementary school, and throughout the years was often seen tinkering around on projects with them. James would even go as far to learn basic programming as a child, and before the age of 12, had even created a web page for his class at school. Although James was known to be shy, he trusted people he was close to. He was very sweet towards his younger sister, and both his friends' parents and teachers alike were impressed by his maturity and intelligence. To add to this, teachers noticed his unusually bright disposition and were rather pleased to have him in their classes. I mean, he was awkward, sure, but he was not entirely reserved. And to add to that, he would consistently demonstrate a deep understanding of the subject before anyone else did in his class. You could even say that, despite the socially awkward tendencies, he was a model student to most teachers. But the bright and prosperous start for James was sadly all about to change, because as soon as he hit puberty, he began to suffer from various mental health conditions. He started to see what he described as nail ghosts at night, hammering into the walls. He also told his parents that he saw visions of bombs exploding and fires burning buildings to the ground. Now, of course, this was extremely traumatic for a child his age, and unable to comprehend what exactly he was seeing or dealing with, he began to socially isolate from family and friends. And tragically, as his condition worsened, it even got to the point where, at the age of 11, he tried to take his own life. Despite their love and care and nurture, his parents were not really the type to talk about feelings. Both having backgrounds in medicine and science, they were more interested in talking about the practical steps forward instead.
49.
At the age of 12, James and his family moved back to San Diego, and this marked a significant turning point in his life.
51.
I mean, any move is a big deal for a young teenager, but this was especially hard for James.
52.
He already had difficulty socializing, and now that all of his friends had been stripped away, he regressed even further. In the neighborhood of Rancho Penasquitos, the local boys, who had already been living together for multiple years, were less than friendly towards James. Sadly, he was unable to assimilate into this neighborhood or the local school as a matter of fact, and as a result, he became completely isolated. Like many kids, James turned towards video games to escape reality. He was especially fond of real-time strategy games, such as Warcraft 3, and as soon as James would return home from school, he would fire up his PC and play late into the night. Now, of course, his parents noticed this, and understandably, they were not too pleased. It was at this moment that his mother took things into her own hands, doing so by going door to door and asking other parents if their children would be willing to spend time with their son. But sadly, despite the effort, all of this would be futile. James's inability to socialize made it almost impossible for the other children to feel comfortable around him. As James moved into his teenage years, his life continued to revolve around this video game. In fact, his highly capable mind and his aptitude for strategy got him to the point where he was one of the best players on his North American server. He played for many hours a day. Even if he could not take pride in his social life, he was at least proud of his accomplishments in this game. Progressing through high school, James was determined to try out for the sports teams at his school. At a height of more than 6 feet, but quite lean, James was not the strongest or the fastest in his class, but did have a naturally athletic build. And so, by the age of 16, and with a little bit of luck, he was playing football and running cross-country with his classmates. Now, despite performing well in sports, his social awkwardness would remain. Actually, the cross-country team coach reported that, when it was time to take team photos for the year, James couldn't even stand close to his teammates and actually ruined the picture. While these social issues weighed him down, he continued to excel academically. And by the year 2006, he had graduated with his high school diploma in hand. And ready to take on college, James enrolled at the University of California, Riverside. It was during this time that he worked as a counselor at a summer camp. His supervisor noted that he was not an easy person to work with, and described him as stubborn, uncommunicative, and socially inept. At university, the students around him also found his behavior to be strange. He never went out of his way to socialize, and although he was never outright offensive, people could not find a reason to want to interact with him.
59.
In the autumn of 2010, James worked at a capsule coating factory found in San Diego County. And while here, one of his colleagues recounted him as being one of the most reclusive people he'd ever met in his life. That opinion kind of makes sense as well, because James was often seen staring at the walls for minutes at a time, and would barely ever respond to questions or prompts by colleagues. Despite this, James would eventually graduate with a Bachelor's in Neuroscience in the year 2010. And after this, he decided to pursue a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Colorado, which of course can be found in Aurora. Living on Paris Street, James moved into a one-bedroom studio apartment, but he wasn't actually a fan of being alone anymore, and so in the process signed up to several dating websites. Without any social interaction for such a long time, he was desperate for some much-needed affection. Again though, he had no idea how to talk to women. To compensate for his lack of riz, he would frequently hire sex workers. And to make matters even worse, he would leave reviews of them on 4chan. Miraculously, James caught a break in October of 2011 when he met a girl from his biology class. She found him to be mysteriously intelligent and especially liked his wit, and so with both of these things in mind, she wanted to get to know him better. Soon after this, the two went on a first date at a local horror movie film festival. Something important to note here, but James was obsessed with movies, especially if they had an anti-hero, typically guided by the best intentions, but often with a flawed character, with a history of bad decisions and questionable morals. Now, James related heavily to these characters, and would often see himself in his favourite anti-hero on the big screen. As James and his girlfriend continued to date, she became more and more aware of his strange social behaviour. He would sometimes make flat, controversial jokes that left people feeling awkward. And with him being so introverted, she would often struggle to introduce him to both her family and her friends. Despite these setbacks, the two enjoyed a somewhat normal relationship. They studied together, loved to watch Saturday Night Live, ate at their favourite Ethiopian restaurants, and would even share Slurpees from the local convenience store. But all good things come to an end, and sadly, these two didn't last very long. The two broke up at the end of 2011, and although they resumed the relationship briefly at the beginning of the new year, it ended shortly after in February 2012. After the breakup, James sought help at the student health clinic for his worsening mental health, and over the next 3 months was seen a total of 7 times by Dr. Fenton. Sadly, the demons in his mind never left him alone. James claimed that whenever he tried to sleep, he would see shadows and flickers in the corner of his eyes, and these shapes resembled fighting each other with firearms. His complete lack of emotion caught Dr. Fenton off guard, especially when he described the violent imagery to her. Becoming so alarmed by this, she would even call on her supervisor to sit in on these sessions and help give insight into James's case. But despite Dr. Fenton and her associates trying to help James, he would continuously refuse their treatment plans, opting to take only mild doses of medication instead. It was noted that James had social phobias, displayed a lack of emotions, and had psychotic tendencies, and Dr. Fenton believed that he may have schizoid personality disorder. Not only would James talk about his fascination with mass killings, but he would even go on to admit his own vague plans to execute one himself, which was extremely concerning information to learn. Now, despite the Student Health Centre offering to treat him, even if his insurance didn't cover the costs, James would actually reject their help, and after the 7th session, left therapy altogether. It is worth highlighting here that Dr. Fenton was deeply worried about James, and she knew that he had serious potential to cause severe harm to others. However, what is more important to highlight here is that she was not allowed to intervene or contact law enforcement, because James never mentioned hurting anyone specifically. It's one of those weird mental health laws where she knew that James was a serious risk, but could do nothing about it. And I'm sure Dr. Fenton was absolutely frustrated by this. Going against his wishes, Dr. Fenton would eventually speak to his mother. She told Dr. Fenton about his long-standing mental health issues since childhood. However, what she failed to tell her was the history of mental illness running in both sides of the family. As it turns out, James had multiple family members who had suffered from both schizophrenia and psychotic break. This information would have been pertinent for Dr. Fenton to know while James was her client, but now that he had left her, it was sadly all too late. During this time frame, James's academic performance also began to suffer. It appeared as if he had stopped caring about his schoolwork, and, unknown to him at the time, behind the scenes, the university was getting ready to expel him. But James would actually beat them to it, and would leave before they could even push him out. Sadly, though, his academic performance was not the only thing to be rapidly declining. Drowning in depression, loneliness, and dysphoric mania, he was left with nobody to turn to, and with no job and no degree to work towards, he was left to his own devices, ruminating with his dark thoughts inside of his one-bedroom flat. And as each day passed by, he fell into a darker place than the day he had been in before. It was at this time in late spring that James began to plan to act on these dark and twisted thoughts that he'd had in his mind for so long. In the last week of May, he purchased himself 2 weapons, a Glock 22 pistol and a Remington 870 shotgun. And on June the 7th, just hours after failing a university exam, he bought himself a 3rd firearm, a Smith & Wesson M&P 15 assault rifle. By July, he had amassed thousands of rounds of ammunition, magazine holders, knives, an assault vest, a gas mask, and gas bombs. Shortly after this, on July the 19th, he sent Dr. Fenton a package. Inside this package was his notebook, and inside the notebook was his dark and evil thoughts and plans that he'd made in the weeks prior. But tragically, this notebook never made it to Dr. Fenton. It was found undelivered in the medical campus room several days later, and had this package been delivered in time, this story may have ended much differently. Now, I'd like to talk about this book for a while, because these pages show the morbid underbelly of James Holmes. Early on in this notebook, he asks himself, what is the meaning of life, and what is the meaning of death? Later on page 27, he clarifies that he believed he had a uniquely mad mind. And in the bottom left corner of this same page, he further writes that a murderer's value equals the number of deaths. On page 29, James claims that life's fallback solution to all problems is death. He also says, I have spent my whole life seeking this alternative to violence, suggesting that he knows the difference between good and evil, morals, and even dislikes violence itself. On page 31, he asks himself, why should life exist, and what is the purpose of living? He further diagnoses himself with a broken mind, citing dysphoric mania, generalized anxiety, schizophrenia, narcissism, and psychosis. It is here that we get to step into his own vulnerable mind, He talks about developing catatonia, a state in which someone is awake but does not seem to respond to other people and their environment. He also talks about isolation and brief periods of invincibility where all of his actions feel like they are in hyperspeed. He then talks about fleeting movements in his peripheral vision, likely talking about the figures that he used to see at night. Kind of glossing over this detail, but he then also talks about his shaft. But let's keep that one out of this video. James also goes into concepts of life, religion, the butterfly effect, and much, much more. You can see that throughout all of these ramblings, he is struggling to make sense of what life really is. And he ends all of this theoretical revision by writing why 246 times. There is more to talk about in this book, but we'll come back to this again in a while. It was on that night that James loaded up his equipment and drove to the local Century 16 multiplex movie theatre in Colorado. It was the premiere weekend to the highly anticipated The Dark Knight Rises, and the theatre was sure to be full. Seen on surveillance cameras with dyed hair, James blended into the crowd as he entered the busy movie theatre. He can be seen purchasing his ticket to the midnight viewing. No one took notice of him. The theatre was packed after all, with an estimated 400 people crammed into one room, all excited to catch the first viewing of this movie. James was sat in the front row of this movie theatre, and watched all of the previews before the movie began. It was 20 minutes into the film that he got up from his seat and exited the theatre from the emergency exit beside the movie screen. James had planned this attack for quite some time. He knew that this door had direct access to the parking lot outside. He propped the door open slightly with a plastic tablecloth holder to ensure that he could re-enter afterwards. He then went out to his car, conveniently parked nearby, and changed into his tactical clothing, donning all black, a gas mask, vest, a ballistic helmet, a bullet-resistant throat protector, leggings, and a groin protector. Those who could initially see him were unsure what they were looking at. Some believed he was dressed in cosplay like many other fans here in the theatre. Others thought that perhaps he was part of a publicity stunt set up by theatre management. But no one was prepared for what he was about to do next. As James turned to face the crowd, techno music blared in his earphones, tuning out everything except for the pounding bass of his music. Throwing a tear gas grenade to the left side of the theatre, James then unloaded the shells in his shotgun, pointing first at the ceiling, then at the back row of moviegoers. As those first shots rang out, chaos filled the room. Blinded by the gas and unable to see or hear, a massive theatre-wide panic broke out. Throwing his empty shotgun to the side, James then withdrew his Smith & Wesson assault rifle and unleashed a barrage of bullets into the aisles from a modified 100-round magazine. After 65 shots, the gun then malfunctioned, at which point James took out his handgun and fired again, losing 5 more rounds into the crowd. Bullets flew through the theatre, and the air was thick with gas and the sound of screams. Patrons were diving for cover in the aisles or sprinting towards the exit, trying to escape from the ensuing carnage. And those in the middle seats of the aisles were stuck as bodies collapsed around them. In the end, a total of 76 shots were fired. 6 from the shotgun, 65 from the assault rifle, and 5 from the handgun. The first of many emergency services calls began at 12:39 a.m. Due to all of the noise, operators could not initially make out what was going on. Voices were unintelligible over the gunshots, screams, and movie blaring in the background. But eventually, that nightmare became understood. As the situation became clear, police were immediately dispatched to the scene. First responders arrived only 90 seconds after the first gunshot rang out, and when they arrived, they witnessed a scene filled with complete mayhem.
Behind the theater, table side, the suspect in a gas mask. I got 7 down and 3 on. 7 down. He's not working on a
99.
suspect is going to be a male, unknown race, black outfit.
100.
He should be wearing a vest, gas mask, and multiple long guns.
Officers entered the crowded movie theatre, which was packed full of panicking civilians. Due to the chaos and congestion in the parking lot, ambulances struggled to park close by. And with the rampage over, James took advantage of this confusion and returned to his car, which was parked out back. Initially mistaken as a member of law enforcement due to his tactical equipment, he was ignored for a while until being arrested later at 12:45. Moments later, he was taken away in the back of a police vehicle, weaving its way through flashing lights and the sounds of the wounded. But unfortunately, James was not done yet, because following his arrest, he emotionlessly told officers that he'd left multiple booby traps back at home in his apartment. The traps were quite elaborate actually, and required not just that building, but all buildings around it to be evacuated entirely. And on top of that, they needed a robot to disarm those bombs. Inside, officers found over 30 handmade grenades and more than 100 litres of gasoline. It also appeared as if James had tried to lure his neighbours into his apartment too, leaving deafening music on before leaving for the theatre. One of those neighbours went as far to approach the door, but then left without opening it, potentially saving her life, as well as many others in the building. Sadly, though, the same couldn't be said for his actions back at the cinema. James Holmes had murdered 12 people, with a further 17 injured from the attack. The town of Aurora was left reeling in pain, sadness, and anger. Jonathan Blanc served for 5 years in the US Navy. He died shielding a friend from gunfire. Jesse Childress was an Air Force reservist on active duty when he was murdered. Jessica Gari was an aspiring sports reporter. John Larimer was a petty officer in the Navy. And Veronica Sullivan was only 6 years old. The others murdered in this attack include Alexander Bowick, Gordon Cowden, Matthew McQuinn, Michaela Medek, Alex Sullivan, Alex Tevez, and Rebecca Wingo. 12 lives were lost at the terrible hands of a cold-hearted and methodical killer. The families and friends of these victims would have their time to grieve, but for now, all eyes were on James. On July the 23rd, James made his first appearance in court. He was given no chance for bail due to the degree of destruction caused by his crimes. And in front of the judge, he was expressionless, looking dazed and unsure of where he was. On July the 30th, prosecutors filed for formal charges against him. These included 24 counts of first-degree murder, 116 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and 1 count of illegal possession of explosives. To help the prosecutors obtain convictions, 2 charges were filed for each victim. Moving into the legal proceedings of this case, one key issue for the court was determining whether or not James was fit to stand trial. On August the 9th, his defense team argued that,